delighted to be here and talk about one of my favorite subjects. I thought before I began my talk, I would pass something around and let you actually sort of hold and touch this. This is one of the Modotti photographs that I'm going to be talking about here on the cover of a publication called New Masses, which was a publication of the American Communist Party 1926 to 1948, I believe. And I think it's fun to look at to kind of get a feeling for the period. There was a lot of back and forth between the communists in New York and the communists in Mexico City. People traveled back and forth. And Modotti's photographs were very often used not only in Mexico, but also in radical left publications in this country and in Europe. So here's an example of that. So let me just pass this around. Okay, well, again, delighted to be here. As I speak, if you have a quick question or would like clarification, don't hesitate to let me know. And then at the end, I hope we'll have some time to discuss and talk about some of these issues that you might be interested in pursuing. 1924, Mexico City. The photographer Tina Modotti exhibited her work for the very first time. She had been living in Mexico for only 15 months. And yet, according to her friend, the artist Diego Rivera, her photography flowers perfectly in Mexico and harmonizes exactly with our passion. And in fact, Modotti spent her entire photographic career, more or less, in Mexico City. Her work is inextricably linked to Mexico, not only for its location and its aesthetics, but also for its political and social engagement. She was attempting a new kind of photography that would help set the course for the Mexican people, that would serve, as she put it, as a cog in the advancing social machine. So, to fully understand the story, however, of Tina Modotti and Mexico during this period of the 1920s, often called the Mexican Renaissance, we need to go back 33 years before she did the self-portrait and travel 6,000 miles to the east.
Can you cut one of the overhead lights off?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Much better.
Okay, so Modotti was born in 1896 in Udine, Italy, near Venice. She was one of 7 children in a poor socialist family. She was 2 years old. The whole family moved to Austria because her father had found work, and they stayed in Austria then for 7 years, came back to Italy when Tina was 9. And then from Udine, then her father left again almost immediately to come to the United States. So again, he was looking for work. And he ended up in San Francisco, which was at this point rebuilding after the 1906 earthquake and fire. Meanwhile, back in Udine, Tina had to drop out of school after only 2 years. She had to take a factory job, help support the family. And then in 1913, when she was 17, her father finally had enough money. He sent her a ticket. And she traveled from Udine to San Francisco all by herself. And that was it. Never again did she go back to Italy. And she always wanted to very much so, but Mussolini came to power not long thereafter. The Modottis, as I said, were staunch socialists. And the communist that Modotti became couldn't risk going back to Italy. She would risk imprisonment or even death if she returned to her own country. So here in San Francisco, then she worked as a seamstress first at I. Magnin department store, seamstress and model. And then she became an actress in the Italian language theater that was flourishing around North Beach at that time. And here too, she fell in love with an Oregon farm boy with the very grand name of Rube Delivery Ritchie, called Robo. He was a farm boy turned bohemian writer and artist. And so he was living in San Francisco. The two of them began living together. 1919, then they moved from here to Los Angeles. And there Tina became a silent film starlet. The two of them made batiks that were quite well appreciated in Los Angeles. And also, they met the photographer Edward Weston. So Weston at this point was 33 years old. He had been working for a while, past 13 years. He'd been making these soft-focused, romantic kinds of images that now deeply dissatisfied him. And at this point, under the influence of Cubism, modernism is practiced by photographers like Albert Stieglitz, Paul Strand. He was feeling his way toward the kind of precise, semi-abstract images of nudes, seashells, peppers, that would earn him a place in the history of photography as a pioneering modernist. So this is then Tina's portrait of Edward from just a few years later, and so you see here that it's a rather jokey kind of portrait. He's portrayed as the master, his pipe and his camera. And very quickly, Modotti became Weston's favorite model. Now, around the same time, too, Tina, Robo, and Edward became friendly with a Mexican writer and politician who was in exile in Los Angeles during the Mexican Revolution. And this was a man named Ricardo Gomez Rivera. 1920, revolution now ended, and relatively stable government in place in Mexico. Rivera returned to Mexico City to take an important position at the Ministry of Public Education. And after that happened, he wrote to invite Robo to come live for a while in Mexico, paint, and also to organize an exhibition of his work and that of his friends, including Edward Weston. So Robo went. Modotti was supposed to accompany him. However, she and Weston were in the throes of a passionate, secret love affair. So she delayed her departure for several weeks, and I should add at this point that Weston was married, very unhappily, had 4 children. So it was, very hush-hush. So Modotti stayed in LA, and then finally she did leave for Mexico City. But no sooner was she on the train just outside Los Angeles than she was handed a telegram saying that Robo had smallpox. Well, she continued on to Mexico City, and less than 24 hours after her arrival, he died. Well, she was devastated. She was overcome with grief, overcome with remorse. However, she was determined to carry out this exhibition in homage to her dead companion. And that exhibition at the National Academy of Fine Arts in 1922 stunned the Mexican art world with Weston's modernist photography and planted a seed in the minds of Modotti and Weston that they might find Mexico the ideal place for a photographer. And so the following year, Modotti and Weston moved together to Mexico City, where Weston was going to teach Modotti photography. Modotti was going to manage their household, manage the portrait studio, with which they would earn their livings, and together they would pursue their art. They were the first modernist photographers in Mexico, and Modotti was a pioneering female photographer in Mexico. So here we see her with her camera on the roof of her apartment building then in Mexico City, and she's with Miguel Covarrubias, who was a Mexican artist tended to be architectural studies and still lifes of flowers. Very often flowers that were imperfect or just slightly wilted. So some people have seen that in a photograph like roses. You see those roses have, you know, they're not wholly fresh. So some people have seen this image as a memento mori, that is a reminder of the lurking presence of death, even in the midst of life's beauty. So along with picture making then, Modotti and Weston right away found themselves participants in Mexico City's vibrant bohemia. 1920s, time when the arts were flourishing, poetry, music, dance, visual arts, and Mexico City was teeming with artists, adventurers, radicals of all kinds, both Mexican and foreign. Years later, one of these foreign artists, French artists, coined the term the Mexican Renaissance for this post-revolutionary era of the 1920s. So it's a construct. It's a name that emphasizes the European influences upon artists at this time. There were many. And also likens this decade to the Italian Renaissance, both periods being characterized by exceptional artistic energies, by humanistic values, by enlightened patronage, and by the attitude that art is an important public activity and one that has significant political consequences. And in fact, at the weekly parties that Modotti and Weston gave, as soon as they got to Mexico, the conversation would gravitate to politics as often as to art. We certainly have been plunged into a swirl of communism here, Weston wrote his wife. Almost all of our acquaintances are active participants in revolutionary activities. A new revolutionary newspaper is being published, El Machete. I know personally nearly every one of the contributors and editors. Most of them appear at our Saturday nights, and most of them are artists. So let's briefly set the larger scene here. So 1923 then, the year that Modotti and Weston moved to Mexico City. Mexico was more or less stabilized after the revolution. And as I think you heard earlier this morning, I'll go through this briefly, the country had been ruled by, for 3 decades, since 1877, by a dictator named Porfirio Diaz, who created a strong central government, modernized the economy, and made himself and his cronies enormously rich. During that period, Mexico had been marked by enormous divisions of wealth, property, and power. Only 2% of Mexicans had owned land. A majority were living as tenant farmers on these estates of the wealthy, and those who were lucky were working 7 days a week. Life expectancy was 30. And then in 1910, Mexico held a large and obscenely expensive celebration of the centennial of Mexican independence. Shortly thereafter, a man named Francisco Madero, who was a political rival of Diaz, called for an uprising. And indeed, on the appointed day, these small guerrilla groups, such as we see here, sprang into action. Meanwhile, much of the army, Diaz's army, which consisted of conscripts, many of them deserted, and fighting spread. Within months, Diaz was forced into exile, at which point the revolution turned into a very complex civil war that eventually killed over 1 million people. Among the leaders of its many factions was Emiliano Zapata, we see here, the small landowner from Morelos, who led the fight for land redistribution under the banner Land and Liberty. So here is a small section from a panel that Rivera did in the Cortez Palace in Cuernavaca. We see Zapotec with his famous white horse. So eventually, the revolution then produced a new constitution, created labor unions in Mexico, and began this process of land redistribution. 1920, Mexico had a new president, Alvaro Obregón, who then granted amnesty to all factions and promised further reform, particularly land reform. So Obregón's authoritarian yet reformist government also made the very first attempt to educate Mexicans of all classes. So education system, you can imagine, was in shambles after the revolution. The illiteracy rate in Mexico was 80% at this point. So Ministry of Public Education then institutes a lot of teacher training programs. The government prints free editions of classic books, Shakespeare, Dante, and so forth, and distributes them free of charge to the people. And also recruits Peace Corps-style volunteers to build schools out in rural villages. It recruits artists as well, so giving them the walls of public buildings that they seized upon to create the didactic, political, and populist murals. The Mexican mural movement is born with Diego Rivera getting the walls of the Ministry of Public Education itself. So, larger idea here is to renew Mexico's cultural identity. Why was this important? Well, okay, for one thing, Mexico, next door to one of the largest and most powerful nations on earth. Mexico had a history of control by foreign owners, industrialists, speculators, and so forth. So Porfirio Diaz himself reportedly said, "Poor Mexico, so close to the United States and so far from God." So moreover, 1920s, Mexico has just emerged from this horrific civil war that pits North against South, landowner against non-landowner, one private army against another private army. So, very fractious country. And Mexico was comprised of over 50 distinct indigenous groups, each with its own language, its own culture, people of European descent, Spanish descent, other European descent, and above all, people of mixed blood. So here was this new government seeking to establish its authority over this very fractious nation, and the question was urgent: what binds us together? What does it mean to be Mexican? So there was this need then to define and affirm Mexican cultural identity, mexicanidad. And of course, opinions differed. So what was this all about? So some people then argued that the essence of Mexicanness lay in the fact of its mixing of races. So they call it the mestizo culture, essentially this mix of European and indigenous cultures. And in fact, about 60% of Mexicans at that point were mestizos, identified themselves as mestizos. On the other hand, for Tina Modotti, Diego Rivera, and many artists and intellectuals, Mexico's genius was rooted in its indigenous or Indian cultures. So these artists and intellectuals then celebrated Huasteco and Tarahumara and Mixtec and Zapotec, so on, customs, objects, focusing on the indigenous idol lurking behind every Catholic altar and the mother goddess inside every Madonna. They also viewed these indigenous communal societies as proto-communist. That was another link. So here, for example, in these two Modotti photographs, one on the left was taken in Xochimilco, the so-called floating garden south of Mexico City. And so these two workers then are dredging up silt from the bottom of the lagoon there, and will use it for fertilizer on the islands. And on the right, a stall in the Alameda selling Indian wares. So this was, Modotti was very much loved children, so I'm sure that was part of the reason this photograph came into existence, but also her love of these objects, which she often photographed as still lifes. So besides photography, then Modotti soon became active in humanitarian relief work and anti-fascist, leftist political causes. She was an extremely compassionate person. She felt an acute sense of duty to her fellow human beings, and thus to furthering social justice. Of course, such a commitment can take immense amounts of time. So she's trying to do photography. At the same time, she's lamenting, and she said to Edward in a note, "I put too much art in my life, too much energy, and consequently, I have not much left to give to art." So there's always this tension between the two. There was also a new tension now between Modotti and Weston, because her politics now begin to drive a wedge between her and the apolitical Weston. And for that reason and others, the love affair of Tina Modotti and Edward Weston ends after about 2.5 years in Mexico. He goes back to California to his wife and 4 kids, and she stays on in Mexico City. And in Mexico City, then, Modotti now is supporting herself as a photographer. One of her jobs, besides doing a lot of portraits, one of her jobs was as official photographer for Diego Rivera. So if you think about it, so he's doing these murals. By definition, a mural can't travel. It's part of the wall on which it's painted. And so if people outside Mexico City wanted to see the famous murals of Diego Rivera in this day before television, internet, and so on, the way they had to do that was through the photographs of Tina Modotti. So she took actually over 100 studies of these murals, and then these were then reproduced in a lot of magazines, other publications abroad, books and so forth, and also sold as sets and individual prints, 50 cents a piece. She also modeled for Rivera. So here, for example, is her depiction of her as Virgin Earth. Really beautiful painting in a really wonderful setting. It's a former chapel at Chapingo, which is just outside Mexico City. So a new agricultural university coming into being at that time. And Rivera then decorated a whole program of murals in the Assembly Hall, formerly the chapel, but now the Assembly Hall, the theme of which was the liberation of the land. So Modotti modeled for actually a few of those models, but here's one of the most beautiful. So around the same time, in 1927, Modotti officially joins the Communist Party, 600 members strong. Rivera is another staunch communist. And many other artists and intellectuals who believe that the Mexican people are still being shortchanged, that communism offers the best hope for their future. So meanwhile then, Rivera is still working on this colossal program of murals back at the Ministry of Public Education. In all, there were 235 panels covering 15,000 square feet, three stories. An amazing feat, including this panel distributing arms. So a panel in which he orange shirt, and Tina Modotti here with the red top and the black skirt, handing out weapons and ammunition to these factory workers you see here, who are about to charge outside then and join the rural workers in the huts outside in this uprising. And you can see that they're actually fighting under a flag that combines the hammer and sickle with Zapata's old slogan, land and liberty, tierra y libertad, up there. So using that was a slogan that the communists had then adapted. So besides Kahlo and Modotti then, Rivera has included in his mural a number of other well-known artists and intellectuals. The man on the very far left there is David Alfaro Siqueiros, another one of the muralists. And the man in the overalls there with the hat, who's looking at Modotti, was a Cuban communist by the name of Julio Antonio Maiya. So, very charismatic young man, Cuban intellectual, revolutionary leader. And as I think you can see from that look that Modotti is giving to him, the two of them were very deeply in love at this point. However, their relationship was going to be short-lived. So one evening, 1929, two of them were walking home together. They're in central Mexico City. And two gunshots ring out from behind. Maiya is critically wounded. He's rushed to the hospital. A few hours later, he dies. So he was assassinated by agents of the then Cuban dictator. And very quickly, he becomes this kind of symbol around which the left revolves. His funeral procession in Mexico City shuts down the whole center of the city, turns into a kind of vast demonstration, and there are protest meetings that continue, and they take place as far away as Madison Square Garden in New York. However, the Mexican police falsely accused Modotti of being behind the murder. So they claimed it was a crime of passion. And in fact, this accusation is an attempt to cover up the fact that it was a political assassination. So they then burst into Modotti's apartment. The apartment's turned upside down. Her belongings are confiscated. Her personal letters are given to the press. The press publishes photographs, letters. There's a really ugly smear campaign against her all over the front pages of the Mexico City newspapers. She's questioned by the police, as we see here. She is put under house arrest, and then she's tried and eventually acquitted. But not long thereafter, so still in 1929, the government, which over this decade of the 1920s had grown increasingly repressive, begins a crackdown against the Communist Party. And the communists themselves, acting on orders from Moscow, had also hardened their positions. So now Modotti is arrested a second time, this time on trumped-up charges that she had conspired to assassinate the president of Mexico. And this time she's thrown into prison and then released after a few days, but given only 48 hours to put her affairs in order, and then she's escorted to a ship in Veracruz, and she's deported. So, a series of events then is the turning point in her life. At this point, she stops being a rebel, she becomes a revolutionary. And she never gets over the loss of Maiya. She carried his picture with her until the day she died. She then went to Berlin, where she tried to make a living as a photographer, but she had a lot of problems And after only 6 months, then she leaves for Moscow, where she becomes a communist bureaucrat, a humanitarian relief worker, and a Stalinist operative. At this point, life finally wins out over art. Very reluctantly, she puts her camera aside and devotes herself instead to the anti-fascist, pro-communist cause. 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out. Modotti is sent to Spain. And for the duration of that war, she demonstrated enormous courage as an organizer and a nurse for the Loyalist cause. After Franco's victory in Spain, 1939 then, Modotti returns to Mexico, where she lives semi-clandestinely under an assumed name. A broken woman in many respects, privately troubled by doubts about the course she had chosen for her life. And then at the tragically young age of 45, alone in the back seat of a taxi, she dies, probably from heart failure, although rumors have persisted that her Stalinist comrades poisoned her because her commitment to communism was wavering. At her burial, her friend, the poet Pablo Neruda, read the elegy he had written for Tina, in which he describes her as bees, shadows, fire, snow, silence and foam combining with steel and wire and pollen. Soon thereafter, Mexico City's leading modern art gallery organized a memorial exhibition for Modotti with 50 Modotti photographs, poignant reminders of what Modotti once called the tragic conflict between life, which continually changes, and form, which fixes it immutable. So let's turn now from life to form and take a closer look at some of her photographs. So here's one, the 1926 Workers' Parade. Around the time that Modotti committed herself to communism, she decided that photography should not be about self-expression, but rather that it should have social and political meanings. She also felt that there is no such thing as a class-neutral photograph, meaning she believed that every photograph necessarily serves one social class or another, and she didn't want hers to decorate middle-class living rooms. So she stops doing the architectural studies, she stops doing the flowers, and she focuses instead on photographs of, with, and for Mexican workers. So photographs that she hopes then will be a force for positive social evolution and revolution, helping to bring about the triumph of the proletariat and the emergence of a classless society. This same time, too, she begins insisting that whenever her photographs are exhibited, that the venues, the galleries, and so forth, extend their hours, change their hours, so that their hours accommodate not only middle-class office workers, but also the schedules of factory workers and peasants. So here then is the very first photograph of this new kind, called Workers' Parade. So she was 1926, it's the May Day Parade, May 1st, Labor Day. She's on the roof of a friend's apartment building, and she's looking down at the demonstration, the parade going on below. And she takes this photograph then of these marching farm workers, and you can tell they are from their hats, their sombreros, their manner of dress. They have the white cotton duck outfits, and then the serape. You can see the sort of traditional Mexican blanket-like shawl worn by the men. My question for you is, what do you think she's trying to achieve with this image? What's her point here, as you would see it? What message is she sending to the Mexican people? Okay, unity, absolutely. And what is it about the image that makes you say that? What do you see?
Well, working people marching together.
Okay, working people marching together.
Lower class working people.
Well, the campesinos. Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. So all campesinos, yes. Anything else that you see just by looking at the image?
It's almost like they're in uniform.
I'm sorry.
It's almost like they're marching in uniform, not just their position, but their clothing and sombreros.
Yeah, very much so. So all the same.
Right.
Yeah, as a kind of a whole rather than
Exactly.
individuals.
Are there any women in there?
I don't believe so.
I see movement forward.
Yes, yes. So a sense of the progression of that class.
Strength in numbers.
Absolutely, strength in numbers. Notice there's no horizon line. It's all you see is this group. Yes.
It seems peaceful. They aren't lifting up their arms in protest or anything. They're just marching quiet.
Right. So advancing the advancing social machine. Yeah, very much so. And notice too that no single individual is more prominent than any other. They're all seen at about the same size. You can't distinguish one from the other. It's basically an image of a class. So trying to arouse then workers' awareness of class solidarity and empower them. Now, in fact, 1926 on, Modotti's images can be mapped onto the political, social, and artistic history of the Mexican Renaissance. And when I say that, I don't mean to say that she documented 1920s Mexico in the sense of a kind of neutral witnessing. Because, in fact, very often she worked the same way a film director works. Setting up her camera on a tripod, arranging shots with her subjects, and also choosing objects for their symbolic importance. So here, for example, we have two images, both of which relate to this communist newspaper that we heard about, El Machete, and we have these two images of workers reading El Machete. On the left, that seems to be an urban worker, and notice his headline on the paper he's holding is "Down with War Against Russia." And on the right again, we can tell by the hats, these are farm workers, and the headline on their paper reads, "All the land, not just pieces of land." So appropriate, yes.
So you're saying that 1927 on, she has composed scenes, and before that she took pictures that were actually occurring?
Yes, well, up to that time, she did a lot of still lifes and sort of architectural scenes. She would work with a tripod, a large format camera. But from this point on, not always, but often, she actually sets up her shots. Again, not in every case, but in many cases. So here we have this group of farm workers gathered around the newspaper. So newspaper cost 5 centavos, so that was too much generally for an individual worker to afford. His daily wage was about 30 centavos, so the idea is share your newspaper. And just want to point out, notice, I think you can see in both of these, this newspaper then that was published by a group of artists. Rivera was involved, Siqueiros was involved, Modotti was involved, and so there were a lot of illustrations, a lot of pictures. So it was almost kind of a picture newspaper. So these two images then, both set of images functions in effect as a kind of ads for El Machete. 1920s, also a decade when Mexico City was transformed by industrialization. Modotti's subjects include industrial subjects, so modern Mexico in the making. So a lot of construction sites, storage tanks, streetcar tracks, loading docks, scaffolding, and so on and so forth, that she photographs in a style that's characterized by dynamic rhythms, bold patterns, dramatic angles. So telephone wires, for example, here on the left, just becoming a common sight around Mexico City. 1927 was the year that telephone service was first inaugurated between Mexico City and the US, Canada, and Cuba. 1927, President of Mexico makes a well-publicized long-distance call to one of the provincial governors. So there's a lot of hoopla around the telephone, because here's a technology that, again, promises to knit the nation together and connect it with the wider world. In the opinion of Modotti and others, it also promises to disrupt conventional thinking and liberate the imagination. So it's not unlike today's electronic technologies. There was a lot of talk about the human effects of this new technology, a lot of hopeful speculation. And so what we have Modotti doing here on the left is shooting up from a low angle so that she can catch that kind of crisscrossing of wires, and the crossing of wires with the clouds to create a kind of visual and auditory excitement, almost as if these wires are vibrating with conversations. And then on the right here, the storage tank, we have this solitary worker up there on that enormous ladder, so seen heroicized, appears on his own to be operating this vast piece of equipment. So there was a group of writers in Mexico City called the Estridentistas, the strident ones, who shared Modotti's celebration of the dynamics of urban Mexico. But she was the only photographer who was doing this kind of thing, handling this kind of subject matter, and doing it in such radical form. Mexican photographers were involved with romanticized documentary styles, and foreigners who came to Mexico, foreign photographers, were looking for the picturesque. So, a Marxist. So she believes, of course, that the most important features of society are its economic classes and their relationships to each other in terms of modes of production. So many Modotti images like this one depict tools. So here we have, for example, the fisherman's nets, the intellectual's typewriter, and the construction worker's shovel. So, what's going on in this picture? What do you see her doing in this case? What does this picture seem to be about? Right in here. Okay.
Strong but humble.
Very much so, yeah. Strong but humble.
Honest labor.
Honest labor, okay. What makes you say that?
Well, it's almost like a prayer goes with the hands.
Very much so, yeah. It's a moment of reflection, or yes, very much a kind of prayer. Prayer pose. Anything else?
Campesino dress.
Okay, yes, you can tell that here we have a campesino. Look at those amazing hands and the nails. One of the things I think that's very beautiful about this photograph is that it has a strong sense of tangible reality. We can really feel, I think, the coarseness of the cloth, that texture, the metal, even the sun kind of warming the skin. It's a very it's very beautiful in the sense of photographic values, and a very beautiful composition.
You also
It's
see
tight.
a stage of development.
Okay.
You see a stage of development,
Okay.
non-mechanized.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, yeah. And so, respect and appreciation of that fact. Does the image leave you? Yes.
The one thing I just noticed about this photo when I look at it is that the texture of the tool is almost similar to the texture of the table.
Yes, very much
there's
so.
sort of this identification between the two.
Yeah, so it's as if the hands and the tool are, they're almost one. And also the texture is, the focus is on both together. And the rest is allowed to be a bit soft. Yeah. Does the photograph leave you wondering anything?
I think it leaves me wondering why she didn't include the worker's face.
Okay, and why do you think maybe she didn't?
That's sort of up in the air, I believe.
Okay,
Yeah. Perhaps that's the way the industrial power or the elite class view the workers. Faceless.
oh, it's faceless?
Faceless, yes.
Okay,
Sure.
okay. You had a comment?
I look at it more as a representation of all workers, that rather than give it a particular face, that should represent or depict all the workers. The other thing that strikes me interesting is that his clothes are white, but they're dirty. And so, but yet they're beautiful at the same time.
Mhm.
So we look beyond the dirt, at least I look beyond the dirt to see the beauty of it. So
Yeah,
that the worker depicted in a honest way, but realistic way, but still there's beauty in it.
yes. And I think too that I think that's a good point. I think often in her images of this kind, you don't see the faces, and the person that kind of stands for all of humble, hardworking Mexico. Did you?
That's what was
Okay.
Well, to continue your thought, the archetypal worker, it's a Marxist message, labor is the source of value.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So, just to stay on this subject of tools for a minute, Modotti also considered herself simply a worker with a tool. Her tool happened to be a camera, and she, no more than any of these people, had a job. In her case, her job was to make photographs worthy of a place in social production, as she thought of it, to which we all should contribute. So, she herself didn't want to be called an artist, simply another worker with a tool, and that tool was the camera. So, Rivera, turning to Rivera for a minute. Like Modotti, the muralists were aiming to educate, activate the Mexican people, and one of their favorite strategies for doing so, for conveying their messages, was the use of Christian symbology. So Mexico, of course, primarily Catholic country, and pretty much everyone was familiar with Christian symbols. So, for example, we see here in the work of Diego Rivera on the left, here is an industrial worker embracing a farm worker, and notice the farm worker wearing the sombrero there, looking very much like a halo, and also his serape, looking very much like the robes of a priest or a saint. Similarly, on the right, we have, here's a mine, and we have these workers who are leaving after a long day of work. You can see night has fallen, and before they take off, however, they have to be searched to make sure they're not stealing something. So we have this man here in the white, and he's got his arms outstretched then in a position that recalls the position of Christ on the cross. I think maybe even that triangle, one can see that as a reference to the Trinity. There are a lot of sort of Christian, very subtle Christian messages here, and something similar then here going on in the left, this child, the son of an agricultural worker, shot from a low angle, heroicized, and wearing his sombrero, almost like a halo. And on the right here, this man who is carrying these, he's carrying ceramics. You can see the pot there, the vessel, right? It's kind of outlined in the straw, and carrying this enormously heavy load then of these ceramic pots covered with straw on his back. This is before there were a lot of trucks in Mexico. Another halo-like sombrero and a bowed head. So again, reminiscent perhaps of Christ on the cross, a kind of image of sacrifice. And Modotti also made a number of very pure and peaceful images of women with babies, some of which recall images of the Virgin Mary with her child. So notice here, this is no doubt an Indian woman. You can see the little bit of fabric, and then the pitate, the traditional woven mat, palm fibers in the back. So this is one of Modotti's most popular images. And here too, a kind of similar strategy where this hands and feet seem to stand for a whole class of people. And here too, perhaps a kind of Christian resonance. If you think about how in the Bible to sit at the feet of someone is to occupy the place of a learner, about how Christ washed the feet of the poor. So 1927 then, Modotti undertook a series of still lifes that eloquently summarized Mexican radicalism in the 1920s. So this is a series in which she uses a repertoire of populist objects on one hand and communist symbols on the other, symbols of revolution. So in the case of the image on the left, we have the sombrero then, which is shown along with the hammer and the machete, so used by peasants to harvest their crops, mow their weeds, and one communist poet says, to humble the arrogance of the godless rich. So both an everyday tool and a symbol of revolution. And on the right, we have then the bandolier with the bullets, of course associated with revolution, the ear of corn, Mexican staple, and the guitar, it's a popular instrument. So putting these together then, suggesting that they naturally belong together. So very elegant images, beautifully composed, well-calibrated lighting, again, to bring out the material textures of the straw, the corn, the metal, and so forth. So interesting, and there's a kind of seamless fusion between this kind of aesthetic elegance and rigor on one hand, and this very politically charged subject matter on the other. So she's come up with a fresh solution to the problem of how to be both strikingly modern and politically potent, because making images like this in Mexico in 1927 was kind of like lighting sticks of dynamite because of the way they link popular culture to communism. And communism at this point then is becoming seen as a growing threat to the Mexican ruling elite and its U.S. allies. So in fact, by this time, Mexico has changed a lot from the time Modotti first arrived in 1923. In 1924, President Obregón was succeeded by a man named Plutarco Elias Calles, president from 1924 until 1928. Calles was the founder of the political party that later became the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, would rule Mexico for 70 years, up until 2000. When he was president, Calles, then, his strategy was to promote this myth that in fact the Mexican Revolution had been a unified uprising. And Calles then transforms his own former enemies into national heroes, thus asserting that his party was synonymous with the revolution, hence with the will of the people, hence should remain in power, and that's exactly what happened. And yet, land reform lags, cronyism flourishes, and so forth. 1928, Calles' protege, a man named Emilio Portes Gil, becomes president of Mexico, but Calles continues as the de facto ruler. So Portes Gil was little more than a puppet, a situation that Modotti slyly comments upon in a whole series of photographs of puppeteers. So the literal story of these photographs is that she had become friendly with a man named Luis Bunin, who was an apprentice of Rivera's and also made marionettes, so he had this sort of puppet theater. And he would go around presenting these plays he had written, sort of using puppets again for social and political commentary, but like Modotti, kind of coming at it through metaphor and association rather than head on. So earlier I said that for Modotti, Mexicanness or Mexicanidad resided in the nation's Indian cultures. And one of the most fascinating groups then to Modotti and her circle were the Tehuanas. So these Zapotec Indian women who live on the Isthmus of Mexico, state of Oaxaca, and the town of Tehuantepec is one of the major towns where they live. The reason why this group in particular is because these Tehuanas in this area run the markets, they handle the money, they organize the fiestas, they are strong and stately and proud, they don't take gruff from anybody, and so it's often viewed as a matriarchal culture. It's also a culture that's been mythologized for its resistance to the Spanish invasion of Mexico back in the 16th century, because that invasion is often seen in gender terms. So the rape of indigenous Mexico by the conquering Spaniards. So then the Tehuanas become these symbols of sort of authentic anti-colonialist Mexico during the 1920s, when the main form of colonialism is economic colonialism from the United States. For a Mexico City woman to wear the Tehuana huipil, the blouse, and this long ruffled skirt was to show that she was militantly populist, militantly Mexican, and opposed to foreign exploitation, particularly from the United States. And let's end then with these two images. So again, on the left we have the self-portrait of Tina Modotti. This is her only known self-portrait, done in 1929 on a visit to Tehuantepec, where she traveled after Maiya's murder to rest and recover. So by virtue then of wearing Tehuana dress, she's making a political statement, but at this point she's also aware that she's no doubt going to have to leave Mexico, and that thought is breaking her heart. So Modotti then was one of the first of these radical left women to wear Tehuana dress, but she wasn't the last. So she actually often gave advice on proper communist dress to her younger protege, Frida Kahlo. And Frida Kahlo, who the same year, 1929, then will marry Rivera. And in fact, just a little aside, but their wedding reception is on the roof of Tina's apartment, festooned with drying laundry that they all agree makes a nice atmosphere. And so Modotti then giving advice to Kahlo, and Kahlo we see here in one of her many self-portraits. So on the left in colonial dress, on the right in Tijuana outfit. So it's kind of elaborate self-presentation, many self-portraits made of Kahlo, then the most famous Tijuana dress wearer of all. So both women, however, wearing these outfits is an expression of their deep love for Mexico and their commitment to the Mexican people. Okay. So if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to answer for you. Yes?
On your last slide.
Yes.
What was the red? I couldn't quite make out
Oh.
what that red.
See,
was on her heart.
The
heart? Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's a good, yeah, okay, it was a heart. She had, it was the green heart. Again, it's both an Aztec symbol and Catholic. So you'll probably hear more about, I'm sure you'll see this image again this afternoon, so I'm sure you'll hear more about that at that time. Anybody else? Yes?
Well, notwithstanding their desire to stand for the women of the West Bank,
Yes.
can't you read it in the reverse as a sort of a form of complete appropriation of things that they are not? I mean,
Certainly you could, yeah. Although if they didn't, they saw it as a form of solidarity, as a form of respect. But it's true. I mean, it's very interesting if you think about Kahlo, for example, because often one talks about Kahlo in terms of her painting her own truth, and yet, she was not of indigenous ancestry or yes, and mixed, but yes, it was, she's a great, perhaps a great grandfather, but it was that was not who she technically was, but it was who she related to in her heart. Yes.
I'm struck by the fact that Modotti, here she is taking all these, in some way, iconic photographs of this era, and yet, she's Italian, and we have Frida Kahlo of her German ancestry. Were there not any women that they mentored that were Mexicans? Did she share her talent or gift as she was mentored by Weston? Was there anyone that she mentored that was a Mexican woman?
Yes, very much so. She was a mentor notably to Manuel Alvarez Bravo and his wife Lola Alvarez Bravo. When she had to leave Mexico, suddenly, 48 hours notice, she gave them her cameras and she also gave them her commissions. So there's that lineage, and then Manuel Alvarez Bravo, who had this long and very wonderful career as a photographer, among other people he mentored, Graciela Iturbide, who is a contemporary photographer who thinks of herself in this lineage from Modotti on. So yes, she's been an inspiration to many Mexican photographers, and during her time in Mexico, in fact, interacted and encouraged many artists, photographers, writers. And she felt Mexican in a sense, I think in part because she couldn't go back to Italy, and she felt at home in Mexico as she didn't in the United States, for example. Yes?
Any connection to the WPA?
Dorothea.
Yes, she in San Francisco through Weston, she knew Dorothea Lange. They were friends. Consuelo Canaga, who was actually not WPA, but sort of in that same mindset. So yes, she did know those people here in San Francisco, but just briefly. I think it's interesting. It's interesting that you asked that, because if you think of Dorothea Lange, for example, her use of hands and gestures, very much a relationship with Modotti's.
So did the WPA people kind of discover her, or is she completely unknown to them?
She was known to them because they had known each other in San Francisco, like for example with Dorothea Lange, before Dorothea Lange actually became part of the WPA. So Dorothea Lange, that was 1935, and she knew Modotti in San Francisco in the mid-20s.
So you think there is a direct?
I do, yes. I think they knew each other's work, and I think they respected each other as photographers.
But just that's an interesting. You can stretch it out, because when I'm watching all the hands and things, I'm hearing Neruda talking, because he wrote about that seems to be some bond with common people is not like their hands, he wrote about his feet, he wrote about his legs, feet to big, and all in the Canto Popular.
Yes.
So that's all related too. So it's a sort of, it's in the air.
Very much so, very much so. That makes sense to me, what you just said. Yes.
Just a comment, thinking about this era of the 20s in Mexico, Mexican Renaissance, I also think about the 20s in New York and the Harlem Renaissance.
Yes.
I mean, the energy in that decade is like breathtaking. You think of everything that was happening in those two places, it's really quite stunning.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, I agree.
And Covarrubias making a link, because
Yes,
Covarrubias
there you go,
yes,
yeah.
yes,
very much
yes.
immersed in the Harlem Renaissance and running back and forth to Mexico all the time, so.
Yes, and in fact, that magazine I passed around, if you look on the masthead, he was one of the editors of the New Masses, so lots of, lots of connections.
Cross-pollination.
Yes, very much so.
His book, Mexico South.
Yes.
Yes, Oles, yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, in the New Masses, one of the editors was someone, Samuel Putnam, a great translator of Spanish and Portuguese, Rebellion in the Backlands in Portuguese, and well, he's most known for his translation of Don Quixote.
okay.
But he was
okay.
very interested in Mexico.
Right, right, yeah, I just,
Well, really, many people think his translations haven't been surpassed, but it's kind of like Constance Garnett. But,
yes, I'm sure, yeah. Dos Passos was another one, by the way, who came to Mexico. Modotti photographed him. He was back in New York. So, lots of amazing
Lots of
characters
back
and
and
lots
forth.
of exchanges. Okay, thank you very much.